What is voodoo death? Definitely not this. How do Scare's hypotheses apply to voodoo death? You have probably already figured out that voodoo death has something to do with trauma. But how does it happen? The key to understanding voodoo death and trauma is the dorsal vagus nerve. It is the vagus nerve that allows some animals to hibernate, like frogs sleeping through the winter in the mud at the bottom of a creek or a pond, or bears sleeping for months without food and with a pulse rate of maybe 2 beats a minute. The vagus nerve lowers the oxygen demands of the cells, while also slowing down all of the viscera, the heart, lungs, and intestines, the glands of the intestines, and the state of constriction of the blood vessels. In humans, the chief function of the dorsal vagus nerve is to throw the freeze switch and regulate the freeze response. As heart rate and breathing slow almost to a stop, we may collapse or become immobile. This is the mechanism that puts us in a state of dissociation, which is meant to provide protection when all else fails. But when the state continues, especially in humans, we can sink so deeply into a state of low oxygen and slowed pulse that we die, believing ourselves to be helpless and hopeless in the face of a curse. This extreme parasympathetic response can usher us into death, as in voodoo death. Voodoo death is actually a profound freeze response. The person dies with the heart relaxed and full of blood. Though few of us in Western cultures will die a voodoo death, we are all in fact emotional creatures. We ignore this powerful understanding at our peril. Scare believes that this group of very real diseases is the century's hysteria, like those suffering from the hysteria diagnosed in Freud's time. Patients presenting symptoms of these diseases are often met with minimizing, even hostile responses from physicians and from the larger community. Scare has taken a controversial and probably accurate position on these diseases by attributing their etiology to childhood trauma, which is far more rampant in our culture than is commonly recognized. In Scare's words, these are all diseases of dysregulation, diseases that are chronic, insidious, and don't have an endpoint that we can measure consistently with lab tests and imaging, so we don't recognize these diseases as significant or real. Finally, Scare views multiple chemical sensitivities, being overwhelmed by smells or sounds or tastes or textures that would not affect most people, as a condition that echoes aspects of fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. None of the three is associated with any objective abnormality that can be measured, although Scare admits that many of his conclusions are conjectural. He feels certain that time will validate his belief that each of these conditions arises from trauma. typically in early childhood and often before there is conscious memory of the event. He is a tireless advocate of prevention of child abuse and neglect, which he believes is at the root of overlooked and dismissed trauma that emerges decades later when it appears as physical or emotional disease. Scare uses the neurobiological concept of kindling to explain how homeostasis is derailed by strong exposures to trauma. In common usage, kindling is the wood that easily ignites larger pieces of wood. In Scare's paradigm, kindling is a process in the brain whereby pathways that have been sensitized by stress can spontaneously ignite without further stimulation. Sensitized neurons take on lives of their own spontaneously, stimulating neighboring neurons, with no outside event triggering the activity.
Stephen Porges has come up with some additional concepts within his vagal theory, a theory of how the vagus nerve, the two vagus nerves function in the brainstem and then their relationship with consciousness.
In other words, when you start to speak about the freeze response and neurosomatic disorders, it's how does the work that you've been doing with the way that the neurophysiology works affect people's ability to be present?
Sure. Well, trauma is a bell curve. I mean, trauma, my definition of trauma is facing a life-threatening event in a state of helplessness. And that's well accepted, that is the definition of trauma. That's how trauma occurs. But there's, like everything else, there's a spectrum of severity and intensity of negative life experiences that will determine the degree of the response to that, which is to freeze, of course, and the depth and persistence of the freeze response. For instance, a rape victim who is assaulted, physically beaten, and raped, a terrible, terrible trauma, will freeze, which is also to dissociate. Dissociation is what we perceive when we're in the freeze response. And it is also associated with the chemical and the physiological changes in the brain. So we may actually freeze where we become immobile, like the opossum, who's the prototype for the freeze response because he's weak and slow. But the degree of dysfunction, the degree and depth of the freeze will vary based on the intensity of the assault or the trauma. And coming out of it may be more or less difficult based on that severity. Then you've got layered on that the fact that the severity of one's tendency to freeze and the depth of the freeze as an adult is also directly correlated with the burden of trauma that they've experienced throughout their lifespan, especially in childhood. And trauma in childhood will very much leave one more vulnerable as an adult to freeze in the face of even minor threats. So you've got these two continuums going here which determine the outcome when a person faces a traumatic event as an adult.
So when for example, in the ACEs studies that are very well published as far as adverse childhood experiences, those experiences could be not just an experience of having suffered violence. It may be an ongoing source of stress in a dysfunctional family. It may be any number of sources from somebody with mental illness in the family. It might be something that they experienced on a singular basis or a repetitive basis, correct?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And like everything else, it's a continuum. But even what relatively negative childhood experiences, such as a mother who is depressed or mental illness in other family members or alcoholism and the like that would affect the parent's behavior to be a good parent, will still leave a mark on the child. Even though it's something one takes for granted when one's older, you don't even think about it, but it is pertinent.
I think that, for a long time in our culture, you just lived with those things, didn't you?
Exactly.
I mean, everybody had some problems in their childhood who didn't. But I think now we're starting to understand the implications of those.
That's exactly right. And I think the A study is a wonderful study. I wish it were more accessible to the medical profession, who don't really know much about it. But I think that we need to pay attention to even the minor stresses and traumas in one's life in order to understand the outcome and the effect on you, behavior and health. Procedural memory involves is classical conditioning. In other words, learning about things in our life that are good and that are bad, that are safe and that are dangerous. It's basically how we survive, is through procedural memory. That memory is held in the brain, not in the cells of the body, not in the muscles. It's held in the parts of the brain that represent that muscle, that extremity, and that movement pattern. And this memory tends to be for life. It tends to be permanent. We never lose our skills in walking. Unless we have a disease. We don't lose our skills in skiing or playing the piano or the like. They may decay with time, but they're relatively hardwired. And we never forget events that we have lived through that threatened our life. We never forget those. And the body memories for those diminish, but in the case of trauma, they don't diminish. They stay very prominent.
So how does the body, in a sense, hold a memory of something that's been traumatized? Is there a memory in the cells? It's obviously neurologically it's different, and yet there is a remembering. Remember, all memory is in the brain. I don't agree with the concept of cellular memory. Okay. It's controversial, but it doesn't fit the brain model in that the brain doesn't need the cells of the body to remember everything, every cell, what happened to every cell. So the brain remembers everything that happened to the extremity, the pattern of movement, the pain, all of the symptoms or all of the things that were done with the muscle group are held in memory, exactly as they were. You don't need to have cellular memory for the brain to remember every nuance of a motor experience. And in trauma, of course, it remembers all of the movement patterns that the animal or the person did to try to fend off the threat. And if that is not discharged, in other words, if that isn't completed at the end of the traumatic experience, then the brain will remember those things as if the danger is really there. So just to bring that to a very ready experience. So if something attacks you, let's just say a dog came after attacked you, and most people understand we go in the fight or flight aspect of the response. Either I flee from that dog and I'm able to get safe and get behind a fence, or that's not a good option, and I attack it back, and I start to go into some sort of physical expenditure to protect myself.
Yes. If we escape or we overcome the threat, we are no longer traumatized. However, if the threat was severe enough, and we actually went into a little freeze at the time, then our brain brings up the memory of the movement patterns, and we kind of go through a repetition of those movement patterns in the form of a motor action. In other words, shaking, trembling, hitting. Our body replicates the movement pattern in a freeze discharge, and you'll see that in an animal. If they are unconscious or they've frozen, when they come out, they generally shake all over in a pattern which is replicative of the attempt of their muscles and the brain to protect themselves.
Why do you think most people, when we've spoken of the response to trauma, have only heard of fight or flight but not freeze? Why was that so underappreciated for so long, do you think?
Well, it's been underappreciated by people who studied this, actually. Although, people like Selye and Pavlov and Cannon, all neuroscientists who studied behavioral patterns and conditioning, recognized that animals would do this, that they would discharge, if you want. That's some people use that term. Peter Levine uses that term.
Right.
Discharge, not the energy, but the memory. And in that replication of the memory in a safe setting now, the memory of all the motor actions is extinguished like a conditioned response. And so that frees the brain of the burden of holding on to the false memories of what you did to survive, even though you did survive and it's over. Extinction of false memories is really what the freeze discharge is about. The freeze discharge looks like a seizure. I don't know if you've ever seen the polar bear video from the
Yes, I certainly have.
Yeah, a seizure, a discharge often looks like a seizure. Now, because it replicates the failed movement pattern, it looks like an unusual seizure, but you can have if a part of the brain in the motor area, the muscle control area of the brain, is damaged and therefore causes electrical discharges, the person will repeat a movement maybe even in one extremity or on one side of the body. But it generally replicates the movement pattern that was aborted by going into the freeze response. And when you do that, you're extinguishing the memory because it's completing the act of escape, if you wish. That's a good way to put it.
Okay. I've heard also that people say when they've come out of anesthesia, there are certain physical movements that replicate movements that may have gone into that they were doing before anesthesia. So,
correct. Yeah, that happens, and I think that happens. It implies that before the surgery, the person was traumatized by the experience when they go through the shaking. It's like when a mother, a lot of midwives will tell you that women go through shaking after a childbirth. And the childbirth pain may be traumatizing in some women. And as a result, at the end, after the birth, they go through a discharge, a freeze discharge. So I think the same applies to postoperative cases after they awake.
What about for those people that have been, we'll call it in the bodywork field, so the massage therapy, the people that work with somatic hands-on clinicians,
yes,
that work on subtle ways and will often find when people are beginning to truly relax and maybe be present to some suffering that they've caused in their life, there tends to be a rippling or contraction of the abdomen and different types of muscular contractions as they begin to experience things that they've gone through in the past, whether it be feelings or physical traumas.
Yeah, that's well known in body work, that including manual massage therapy, Reiki, even anything whether you manipulate the muscles, even physical therapy where you're doing repetitive movements to improve range of motion. If you approximate the movement pattern that replicated the failed attempt to protect yourself, the brain assumes that you're in a threat now. And it will go through the movement pattern, but in doing so, it's an attempt to complete the act of self-defense. But body work is associated frequently with that, and in fact, there may actually be a release of a deep emotional discharge, sobbing or crying out as part of that.
No, that's important. So when we look at some of the things, and I know that you've worked with Peter and in the somatic world, which is bridging a gap that most neurologists and brain scientists don't often do, or haven't had the opportunity to do. And so that puts you in a unique position, I think, among people that can both speak from an academic level to the neurophysiology of what's happening in the brain, as well as to personally having experienced some of this kind of release. And it's quite unique, and I imagine that somewhat controversial, but I'd like you to speak a little bit, if you might, to your personal experiencing of transitioning from just the academic understanding to the physical experiencing.
Well, I write about it in the introduction to my book, The Trauma Spectrum. The introduction is a story of my trauma and how I came into the field with this burden of trauma and healed a lot of it. I had an eye accident at age 4 where I lost my eye. And I had ether. I was hospitalized blindfolded for quite a while, and I never looked at it as a terrifying experience or a trauma, because I didn't know what trauma was, but it was. And when I got into this field and met Peter and had him do some work, give a workshop to my pain program, and I sent him a few patients who got better with his work, I said, show me what you do. Well, he did. He did a session of SE with me, and my body went into the pattern of self-protection that it had gone into 60 years before. A curling up of the left side of my body, a squeezing of my eye, and tilting to the left, and shaking and trembling and sweating. And I realized medical science has never heard of this thing, whatever it is. And then I realized it's doing what happened 60 years ago when I lost my eye. And then I thought, nobody in medical science knows anything about this. But then I realized it also was like a condition called conversion hysteria. And you know what that is. I'm not sure everybody does who's listening, but conversion hysteria is a repetitive movement pattern or pattern of muscular control or absence of control that occurs in someone who's been traumatized. Usually they've had childhood trauma, and often it's related to the childhood abuse, but it replicates the act of their body during the assault. And it is thought to be psychological by the medical profession. It's called conversion hysteria because it occurs mostly in women. It has occurred mostly in women since it's been studied. Hystera being a derivative of the word for the uterus. So I realized that this was analogous to conversion hysteria, which I think is simply the pattern of a failed discharge of a trauma and then repetitive emergence of that under stress, but never completion, never emerging in a safe place so that it can complete the act of self-defense. So I realized all these things, and I realized that as far as I knew, I didn't know any other doctor who had ever thought this, much less experienced it, much less read about it in this fashion. So that started my career in trauma.